Let's imagine you're 17 years old. It's 1912. You're a young aristocrat, top student, athlete, the dream of every girl. Your father is an industrialist, your mother a famous socialite, and now you're returning home from a trip to France with your parents, sailing aboard a luxurious, brand new transatlantic liner. Your cabin feels less like a room and more like a floating mansion. Polished wood, silk, velvet, gold details. A personal steward is at your service. Musicians play nearby. Chefs prepare your meals. You dine in a grand restaurant with an orchestra playing softly in the background, then head to bed. But before sleeping, you step out onto the deck to get some air. The view is unreal. Darkness, the massive ship cutting through the ocean, the Atlantic like glass, no wind, no waves, not even a ripple. A faint, icy mist glittering in the light of the deck lamps. And above, stars, huge and bright, like they're watching you. You stand there for a while, then return to your cabin, slip into your feather bed while a steward helps you undress. And as you drift off, you think about how in a couple of days you'll be home in New York. Instead, you wake up in freezing water, clinging to an overturned lifeboat while waves crash over you, preparing yourself to die. And the last thing you remember is a strangely cheerful melody, the band still playing on the deck of a sinking ship. Or imagine something else. You're an Irish girl who barely speaks English. You're 20 years old and share a tiny cabin on the lowest deck with 3 other girls. Hard bunk beds, third class. The room basically a metal box painted white. The air is thick, the engines vibrate day and night. You're not allowed upstairs. Stairwells are blocked by grates. You spent every last penny you had on that ticket. You're a young immigrant. After dinner, the kids gather in one of the cabins. Someone has bagpipes. There's dancing, singing, laughter until morning. And all your hope is aimed toward one word: America. You're certain a new life is waiting there. Instead, in the middle of the night, you feel a jolt that throws people from the top bunks. Then the vibration stops. The giant machines fall silent. No one explains anything to you. You stand for a while by locked gates or wander through endless corridors, until finally someone helps you climb a rope to the upper deck. And there, you stand stunned among elegantly dressed strangers, until an exhausted officer finally shoves you into the last lifeboat. As it's lowered, he fires several shots into the air to scare away the men trying to jump in. So you already understand what today's history lesson is about. It's about the Titanic, the most chilling disaster of the 20th century, the tragedy that became legend, inspired radio dramas and films, and yes, the one with DiCaprio you definitely know. The story of the Titanic has fascinated people for over 100 years, and it's easy to see why. It feels almost too perfect, as if someone deliberately wrote it as a moral fable. A story about human arrogance, a gigantic ship, a miracle of engineering, declared unsinkable. It seems that's it. Humanity has conquered the elements, defeated nature, progress has won. And then that ship sails on its first voyage, and sinks together with its own designer. It's also a story about class inequality, so visible it almost looks like satire. On the upper deck stroll the rich in top hats, bankers, financiers, generals with their families, 40 suitcases each, private safes filled with jewelry. Below them, the middle class. Lower still, the poor. And at the very bottom, crammed into narrow spaces, starving emigrants headed for America. And even lower than that, the engine room, where exhausted stokers shovel coal into furnaces, men who will never step onto the upper deck, because a ticket up there costs more than they could earn in 10 years. It's a perfect miniature of society at the time. And then that miniature collides with an iceberg, and dies. And this isn't something invented by writers or filmmakers. People at the time understood the symbolism all too well. The 2 decades before World War I were later called La Belle Époque in Europe and the Gilded Age in America. Roughly from 1870 to 1914, it was a period when everything seemed maxed out. No major wars, booming economies, technology racing forward, education expanding, steamships, railroads, the first airplanes, radio, telephone, telegraph, automobiles, electric lighting. For the first time since ancient Rome, modern sewage systems actually worked. And yet, people had never seen the dark side of progress. No chemical weapons, no carpet bombings, no world wars. There were even serious proposals to ban machine guns as inhumane weapons that no civilized nation would ever use in a great war, because they were considered simply too horrible. It felt like the formula for universal happiness had been finally discovered. Technology and progress would bring peace, comfort, and wealth. The father of our imaginary hero once traveled from St. Petersburg to Moscow in a rattling carriage for days. His son could now board a train, cross Europe, reach Nice in a matter of days, then step onto a luxury ocean liner, a floating palace, and sail to America. It was a world that had invented technology, but had not yet abandoned beauty. Machines were built not just to work, but to look beautiful while doing it. And the Titanic was the perfect product of that world. On the outside, a steel monument to progress. On the inside, a warm, rich, almost theatrical dream built for the chosen few. During the Belle Epoque, the American elite was obsessed with high European culture. It was considered good taste to regularly travel to France and Italy, clear your head, buy a few paintings by fashionable artists, touch the roots of civilization, and show your children ancient ruins and Gothic cathedrals. And there was only one way to get to Paris from New York, by crossing the Atlantic. Bankers and industrial tycoons did it in style. Shipping companies didn't just race to build faster ships, they raced to build the most luxurious ones. They hired the best interior designers, competed in statues, paintings, carpets, china sets, and furniture. They fought over musicians and star chefs. A good steward who remembered the habits of regular passengers was worth his weight in gold. In first class, nobody needed to introduce themselves. Everyone already belonged. These were the same circles from New York, London, and Paris. Third class, on the route from America to Europe, was usually half empty. But on the way back, it was packed tight with poor young migrants chasing a better life. The largest groups were Scandinavians and Irish. Back home, people were hungry and broke. In America, at least there was work, sometimes even fortune. On the opposite pole of this floating world were the people passengers barely noticed at all, the crew. Not just officers and sailors, but carpenters, electricians, cooks, barbers, gym instructors, postal clerks, and stewards. They had their own staircases, their own corridors, their own cramped cabins, all designed to keep them out of sight as much as possible. The work was brutal and poorly paid, but not pure slavery. Even the stokers, the men feeding coal into the furnaces, saw an assignment to the Titanic as a lucky break. This was a brand new ship, technically advanced even in its engine rooms. On older steamships, the boiler rooms were hell, half-naked, blackened men swinging shovels for 12 hours straight. On the Titanic, it was bright, relatively clean, and organized. Not paradise, but a tolerable nightmare. Transatlantic travel at the time was controlled by a handful of shipping companies, and in Britain, there were essentially two giants: Cunard Line, which worked closely with the Admiralty, and the private company White Star Line. White Star was run by Bruce Ismay, the son of the company's founder, and by the time the Titanic was under construction, he had already sold the business to American investors, yet kept his position as chairman and managing director. So the company remained British in every practical sense: British crews, British law, British shipyards. In 1907, Cunard changed the game by launching two brand new liners, RMS Mauretania and RMS Lusitania, ships that were unbelievably fast for their era, capable of nearly 25 knots, about 46 kilometers per hour, and crossing the Atlantic in just 5 days, which mattered a lot because throughout the entire late 19th century, shipbuilders had been competing mainly for speed. The fastest vessel earned the famous Blue Riband of the Atlantic. Newspapers wrote about records, passengers followed them, and ticket sales rose or fell accordingly, to the point where some companies that failed to win the speed race simply went bankrupt. White Star took a different route. Instead of trying to outrun Cunard, Ismay went to his partners at the shipyard, Harland and Wolff, with a specific vision: build 3 ships that do not have to be the fastest, but must be the largest and most luxurious in the world. He openly said he knew his audience: the Morgans, the Rothschilds, the Vanderbilts, people who would easily spend an extra day at sea if it meant they could live in absolute comfort, but who would never sail without restaurants, swimming pools, tennis courts, libraries, and telegraphs. He demanded different salons for different occasions, an army of perfectly trained staff, and insisted that for once, there would be no saving on mahogany, gold, sculptures, or decor. That was how the class of ships that included the Titanic was born: floating palaces rather than simple transport. The vessels were so immense that the shipyard itself had to be expanded, and the largest crane in the world had to be built just to assemble them. The Titanic itself stood roughly as tall as a 10-story building, stretched almost 300 meters in length and nearly 30 meters across, powered by 2 gigantic steam engines producing 30,000 horsepower each, and an additional steam turbine of 16,000 horsepower, spread across 8 decks. The upper decks were reserved for first-class cabins because vibrations were weaker there, and no 2 cabins were the same. Some resembled Renaissance palaces, others Victorian country houses, hunting lodges in the style of Louis XIV, and so on, all finished with rare woods, private bathrooms in the luxury suites, electric lighting throughout, silk bedding and call buttons for stewards. One deck below stood the main dining hall in the style of Louis XVI, with columns, ceiling moldings, and stained glass, run by an Italian chef imported especially for the job. And the final menu that survives today reads like a royal feast: oysters with caviar, flambéed chicken satay, lamb in mint sauce, Olga consommé, roasted pigeon with asparagus, chocolate eclairs, foie gras, all of it served in the middle of the Atlantic. The idea was simple. Even the 5 richest people on Earth should never feel embarrassed to dine on this ship. Beyond the restaurant, there were 2 French-style cafes for after-dinner conversations, a grand lounge with stained glass and sculpted ceilings, a smoking room with an Italian marble fireplace, a library with reading halls, a gentleman's barber shop, a fully equipped gym, a squash court, formal reception halls, a postal office, a heated seawater swimming pool, and even a Turkish bath with mosaic floors. It was not just a liner, it was a 5-star, 7-star, imaginary 10-star hotel long before such ratings even existed. First-class passengers walked through ceremonial staircases, second-class travelers lived modestly by comparison, and third-class passengers stayed in narrow, white-painted cabins. But even they were fed generously with soup, roast beef, and pudding every evening, all included in the fare, which made the journey a bargain for poor emigrants dreaming of a new life. In first class, nobody needed to introduce themselves. Everyone already belonged. These were the same circles from New York, London, and Paris. The upper decks were reserved for first-class cabins because vibrations were weaker there, and no 2 cabins were the same. Some resembled Renaissance palaces, others Victorian country houses, hunting lodges in the style of Louis XIV. A personal steward, orchestras, cafes, lounges, a barber shop, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and a restaurant with a royal menu. All of it existed to make sure the richest people on Earth never felt like mere passengers on a ship, but like residents of a palace, temporarily floating across the Atlantic. Third class, on the route from America to Europe, was usually half empty, but on the way back, it was packed tight with poor young migrants chasing a better life. The largest groups were Scandinavians and Irish. Back home, people were hungry and broke. In America, at least there was work, sometimes even fortune. On the opposite pole of this floating world were the people passengers barely noticed at all: the crew. Not just officers and sailors, but carpenters, electricians, cooks, barbers, gym instructors, postal clerks, and stewards. They had their own staircases, their own corridors, their own cramped cabins, all designed to keep them out of sight as much as possible. The work was brutal and poorly paid, but not pure slavery. Even the stokers, the men feeding coal into the furnaces, saw an assignment to the Titanic as a lucky break. This was a brand new ship, technically advanced even in its engine rooms. On older steamships, the boiler rooms were hell. Half-naked, blackened men swinging shovels for 12 hours straight. On the Titanic, it was bright, relatively clean, and organized. Not paradise, but a tolerable nightmare. In today's money, the ship cost the White Star Line roughly $250 million. Construction took years, laid down in March 1909, launched in 1911, and then another year of fitting and decorating. 26 men died building her, out of about 1,500 workers, and that was considered normal. Safety regulations barely existed. Child labor was normal too. 12-year-old boys were sent into hazardous work without hesitation. The Titanic's hull was assembled from steel beams with large steel plates riveted on top. On straight sections, machines hammered the rivets in. On complicated curves, human beings did it. Rivets were heated until they glowed red hot. A boy grabbed one with tongs, ran to the man with the hammer, and the metal was driven in, thousands and thousands of times. And this is where, in the end, they cut costs. Not on gold, not on statues, not on fine wood. Here, instead of the strongest rivets, they chose a slightly cheaper, weaker option. Years later, the company's managing director Bruce Ismay would almost certainly regret that decision 1,000 times over. But by then, it was far too late. Third-class passengers were not allowed up to the upper decks. The stairways were blocked by locked gates, and it wasn't done out of pure snobbery as much as out of American migration policy. First- and second-class passengers were treated as respectable people. They could disembark freely, their documents were checked formally, and the assumption was simple. If you can afford such a ticket, you're a gentleman, and gentlemen are not interrogated too closely. Third class, however, was sent to Ellis Island, first into quarantine, then through medical checks and social filtering. So in practice, their quarantine began the moment they boarded. They were isolated from the rest of the ship from day one. And beyond all three classes, there was another invisible category: the crew. We already talked about the people of the lower decks, but for them, the Titanic had one problem that mattered more than anything else: lifeboats. The chief designer, Thomas Andrews, proposed equipping the ship with 64 boats. Bruce Ismay objected immediately. "I understand your concern, but where are passengers supposed to walk? The decks will be crowded with boats. You'll scare people." The final decision was 20 lifeboats. The irony is that according to regulations written back in the mid-19th century, this was technically even slightly above the legal minimum. The rules were based on a ship's weight, not the number of people aboard. By then, those standards were absurdly outdated, but nobody bothered to revise them. The Titanic was designed to carry about 2,400 passengers and roughly 900 crew members, around 3,300 people in total. With perfect loading, 20 lifeboats could save fewer than half. In practice, it meant that only 1 out of every 3 people could survive at most. So how did the beautifully optimistic world of the early 20th century deal with this problem? Very simply, let's just not sink. The Titanic was officially considered practically unsinkable. The engineers never claimed the ship was absolutely unsinkable, only that under certain conditions, sinking it would be almost impossible. White Star's marketers quietly removed the "under certain conditions." Newspapers removed the word "almost," and the public received the legend of an unsinkable ship. Ismay didn't protest too loudly. Tickets to an unsinkable liner sold perfectly well. Technically, the Titanic really did look secure. Its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by doors that could be closed from the bridge at the press of a button. The doors were held by electromagnets. When power was cut, they dropped shut under their own weight. The ship could stay afloat with any 2 compartments flooded, or even 4 in the bow. Not only journalists believed in this system, but sailors as well. One passenger later recalled a crewman loading her suitcases and casually saying, "Don't worry, ma'am. Even God himself couldn't sink this ship." That was roughly the viewpoint of the Titanic's captain, Edward John Smith, himself. In interviews, he openly admitted he simply couldn't imagine a modern liner ever sinking. To him, shipbuilding had advanced to the point where serious accidents at sea had become almost impossible. And Smith was no fool. He was 62 years old, started sailing at 12 as a cabin boy, worked his way through every rank, and before the Titanic had commanded 17 ships. His last was the Olympic, Titanic's near-identical sister ship. Smith was assigned to Titanic as the company's most experienced captain, and this voyage was supposed to be his final triumph before a comfortable retirement. Captain Edward John Smith was valued not only for experience, but for charm. He was a social animal in the best sense of the word, perfectly at ease among first-class passengers, on a first-name basis with many of them from previous voyages. For some people, the choice was not the ship, but the captain, and Smith was considered the best in the business, trusted, respected, and genuinely liked. Bruce Ismay knew that perfectly well, which is why Smith was the highest-paid captain in the British merchant fleet, and possibly in the entire world. On the very first day of the voyage, one of the ultra-rich passengers hosted a formal dinner in Smith's honor. This was a celebrity captain, and he brought a significant part of his elite clientele with him aboard the Titanic. Among the passengers were John Jacob Astor IV of the Astor dynasty, one of the richest men on Earth, traveling with his young pregnant wife, Benjamin Guggenheim of the Guggenheim family, whose name now crowns museums and foundations, Isidor Straus and Ida Straus, founders of Macy's department stores, Lady Duff Gordon, also known as Lucille, the fashion designer who dressed half of European high society, traveling with her husband, silent film star Dorothy Gibson, and journalist W.T. Stead, who, with grim irony, had written a fictional story decades earlier about the sinking of an ocean liner. American railroad tycoons, British nobles, the social lions and lionesses of two continents crossed paths in Titanic's corridors. In one of the luxury suites lived Ismay himself, who never missed the maiden voyage of any ship his company launched. Nearby were the chief architect Thomas Andrews and a team of engineers whose task was to observe the vessel in operation and identify flaws while still at sea. One survivor later recalled that the social atmosphere felt almost surreal. You were technically in the middle of the Atlantic, yet it felt like Midtown Manhattan. Everyone was from the same circle. The only major absentee was J.P. Morgan, perhaps the wealthiest man alive at the time. He had purchased a ticket, but canceled at the last moment citing health reasons. The Vanderbilts also withdrew. Their luggage and staff were already aboard, but the family itself disembarked before departure. Many passengers carried wealth in small portable form: family jewelry, share certificates, rare books, and securities worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Someone even brought a personal automobile onto the ship. On April 10, 1912, precisely at noon, the floating palace departed from Southampton. That evening it stopped in Cherbourg, France, to pick up passengers returning from Paris. The next day it docked in Queenstown. On April 11th at 1:30 p.m., Titanic left Irish shores behind and turned west toward America. There were 2,224 people aboard, almost 1,000 fewer than maximum capacity. April was the dead season for crossings. The first days passed flawlessly. Perfect weather, calm sea, and the ship cruising at around 21 knots, impressive by any maritime standard. Passengers walked the decks, chatted in lounges, dined in glittering halls, lived the dream that the ship was built to sell them, completely unaware that they had already sailed straight into the ice field. On the morning of April 14th, Titanic received its first ice warning. Icebergs had been spotted along the route. In itself, this was not shocking. Icebergs were nothing unheard of. They sometimes drifted down from the Arctic, but not usually in April, and not in such numbers. In 1912, the amount of ice was abnormal. Later, researchers would link it to a rare combination of tides and an unusually close alignment of the Moon and Earth. Ships ahead began sending telegrams to Titanic reporting ice. The radio operators received them and forwarded them to the bridge. Ice fields were marked on the map, and the captain slightly adjusted course to pass farther south. But speed was not reduced. In fact, at the insistence of Bruce Ismay, 2 additional boilers were lit in the engine room. Why? We will never know for certain. Maybe Ismay did not want to be late to New York. Maybe he did not want to inconvenience his ultra-wealthy clients. Or maybe, somewhere deep down, he hoped Titanic might snatch the blue ribbon after all. The captain did not argue with the head of the company, especially a man who genuinely believed in his unsinkable ship. The general attitude toward the warnings was simple. Yes, icebergs exist. We've seen them before, and no major liner has ever sunk from hitting one. The lookouts were on duty, their eyes fixed forward. Signals were not formally ignored, but taken calmly. Over the course of April 14th, Titanic received 7 separate ice warnings. In the radio room, however, the operators were overwhelmed. Titanic had 2 wireless men, senior operator Jack Phillips and his junior assistant. Phillips spent part of the morning repairing a broken transmitter and the afternoon transmitting passengers' messages. There was a backlog of outgoing telegrams. Wireless communication in the middle of the ocean was still a miracle, and everyone wanted to send a message like, "Hi Mom, I'm on Titanic. It's incredible." Formally, the radio operators were not employees of the shipping line at all. They worked for the Marconi Company, and passenger messages were always given priority. The first ice warnings were properly handed to the bridge. One crucial message arrived around 7:30 p.m. Another ship reported, "Old man, we've stopped. Surrounded by ice. Coordinates as follows." Phillips, buried under passenger traffic, tapped back an irritated reply, "Shut up, I'm busy." Whether from exhaustion or because he thought the other operator was exaggerating, we don't know. But by bitter irony, this warning was the most important, and it never reached the bridge. Other, less precise warnings did get through. One nearby vessel even reported having scraped ice. Still, no additional measures were taken. Speed was not reduced, course was not changed. Only the lookouts were told to be extra alert. By that point, the captain was not on the bridge. A formal dinner was being held in his honor. He was sitting in the dining saloon while champagne glasses clinked around him. The night was crystal clear. There was no wind. The ocean looked like black glass. And that, as it would later turn out, was the most dangerous sign of all. Calm water makes ice almost impossible to see in time. But no one aboard Titanic knew that yet. Titanic was moving at almost her top speed, about 22 knots, roughly 25 miles per hour. The passengers had finished dinner, had a drink or two, and drifted off to their cabins. At 11:39 p.m., just 21 minutes before midnight, one of the lookouts spotted a dark mass dead ahead and rang the bridge. The exchange was strangely calm. "What do you see?" "Iceberg right ahead, sir." "Thank you." The officer of the watch was in command. He issued 2 orders: hard to starboard and stop engines. Each command, taken on its own, made sense. Either one could have saved the ship. Had they slowed down without turning, Titanic would likely have struck the iceberg head-on, damaged a few compartments, and remained afloat. Had they turned without losing speed, the ship might have missed the ice completely. But instead, both orders were given at once. One set the ship into a turn, the other robbed it of momentum. A 9-story steel giant cannot change direction or stop on a dime. Its inertia is immense. 37 seconds later, Titanic made contact. Because of the attempted turn, the impact did not strike the bow but scraped along the starboard side near the front. The iceberg stayed alongside the hull for about 9 seconds. There was a grinding metallic scream. Chunks of ice scattered onto the deck. Deep inside the ship, watertight doors slammed shut as emergency buttons were pressed on the bridge. Then, the iceberg slid away into the darkness. Titanic came to a stop. Along the starboard side, 6 narrow but long breaches had opened. And here the story of the rivets returned. The steel plates themselves held. The iceberg dented them, but did not slice through. But in several places, the rivets failed. Small gaps opened between the plates. Through those seams, the Atlantic came pouring in. The night was bright. Visibility was several miles. Why was the iceberg seen so late? That question would be asked for decades. It was discovered later that the lookouts had no binoculars. The officer who kept the locker key had been removed from duty at the last moment and forgot to hand it over. But that detail is almost irrelevant. On a night like this, binoculars would probably have been useless. They narrow your field of view. A more likely explanation was the sea itself. When the surface is perfectly calm, ice becomes almost invisible. Icebergs usually reveal themselves by white water and breaking waves at the base, but in still water, there are no waves to expose them. The iceberg may also have been turned with its melted, dark side facing the ship, making it look like nothing but a shadow. Sometimes in these latitudes a false horizon forms, an optical illusion where sea and ice blend into one flat line. All of this is hindsight. On the bridge, there was no time for theories. Officers gathered and sent crews down to inspect the damage. Within minutes, it became clear. This was bad. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was summoned and led to the captain. Andrews asked one question only: how many compartments are flooding? 5. There was hope in the room. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable, but Andrews knew the numbers better than anyone alive. Titanic could survive 2 flooded compartments, or 4 at the bow, but not 5 in a row along one side. The iceberg had ripped open nearly 90 meters of hull. Andrews lit a cigarette and said calmly, "Gentlemen, you have about 2 hours. After that, the ship will sink." At that moment, most passengers felt almost nothing. In first class, it was just a light jolt. In the restaurant, according to one steward, a few glasses simply rattled. Down in third class, it was a different story. A harsh metallic screech, people in bags falling from bunks, then suddenly the engines going silent. And that silence was terrifying. Stewards began waking people. In third class, they banged on doors and ordered everyone to get dressed and gather near the staircases, but the gates were still locked. In first class, they knocked politely and said there had been a small technical difficulty, and that it might be wise to put on something warm and step out onto the deck. People complied without urgency. Some went to look around and then calmly returned to their cabins. Everyone knew Titanic was unsinkable. Seeing a real iceberg even felt exciting. Chunks of ice were lying on the deck. People picked them up, tossed them to each other like balls. Some even carried them into the bar to chill their drinks. No one understood that the ship was sinking, and not slowly. The captain hesitated to announce the truth. He feared panic. He could do the math. With only half as many lifeboat seats as people on board, panic would mean hundreds of extra deaths. Privately, he informed a few of the most influential passengers and asked them to keep quiet. The order to prepare the boats finally came at 12:40 a.m., roughly an hour after the collision. And that's when reality hit. Giving an order is one thing, carrying it out is another. The crew had no drilled evacuation routine for a disaster like this. Many sailors couldn't remember where emergency supplies were stored. The winches were new. Few people really knew how to operate them. The ropes stuck to freshly painted pulleys. Lifeboats descended in jerks instead of smoothly. Even the officers weren't certain how many people each boat could carry, because no one truly believed they'd ever need to use them at full capacity. The captain ordered, women and children first. On each side of the ship, one officer supervised boarding, and each interpreted the same order differently. On the port side, it meant children first, then women, and if there were seats left, men. On the starboard side, it meant women and children only, no men at all. And the strangest part? People had to be persuaded to board the boats. Many refused. Around them was a massive, warm, brightly lit ship with music, power, and comfort. Below was a tiny wooden boat, black water, and the unknown. One passenger said it outright. "Are you seriously suggesting that I leave this ship for that little thing?" As a result, the first lifeboat was lowered half empty. Capacity, 65. Aboard, 28. Another boat left with 37, then 32, and so on. Up on deck, the orchestra was ordered to play, loud and cheerful, to calm passengers and preserve the illusion that everything was under control. Below decks, heroism looked very different. In the flooded boiler rooms, engineers had to extinguish the fires. Otherwise, the boilers could explode when seawater reached them. Firemen worked standing waist-deep in icy water, inside clouds of burning steam. In other engine rooms, mechanics struggled to maintain steam pressure for as long as possible. That pressure powered the generators, and electricity meant light, communication. Another battle was unfolding in the wireless room. Jack Phillips and his assistant were sending out the distress call and the ship's coordinates. At first, Phillips used the old Marconi Company signal, CQD, meaning "come quick, danger." But by then the international code had already changed to SOS. His assistant joked, "Let's send SOS too. We've never actually used it before." And Phillips switched to the new signal. He barely left the key. The job now wasn't just to cry for help, but to figure out who was nearby and how fast anyone could reach them. The radio waves traveled far. The signal was picked up by the German ship Frankfurt, by the passenger liner Carpathia, by the Russian vessel Burma, and even by Olympic, Titanic's sister ship. Some operators couldn't believe what they were hearing. How could a supposedly unsinkable ship be sending SOS? Olympic replied that she had changed course and was coming to help, then asked, "Are you moving toward us?" Phillips answered with bitter irony, "We are putting the women into the lifeboats." It was already obvious that no rescue ship could arrive in less than 3 or 4 hours. And the cruel twist? Another ship was incredibly close, about 6 miles away. From Titanic's decks, her lights were visible in the dark. It was the Californian, stopped for the night among the ice to avoid danger. Ironically, she was the very ship whose radio operator Phillips had snapped at hours earlier. By midnight, Californian's operator had finished his shift, shut down his equipment, and gone to sleep. Back then, nobody required wireless operators to keep 24-hour watch. Passengers and part of the crew on Titanic saw rocket flares in the distance, but assumed they were fireworks. On luxury liners, that wasn't unusual. The captain of the Californian was asleep. No one thought it urgent to wake him. The officers on duty didn't know Morse code, so they couldn't establish light signals. At the same time, out in the frozen darkness, the opposite was happening aboard the Carpathia. The ship's radio operator was about to go to bed, but decided to check the airwaves one last time. By pure chance, he caught Titanic's SOS. He ran straight to the bridge. Captain Arthur Rostron reacted perfectly. He ordered an immediate course change, had the lifeboats prepared, summoned the stewards, assigned duties, told the kitchens to prepare hot food and medicine, and ordered every blanket and coat on board to be gathered. Furniture was cleared from dining rooms to make space for survivors. Every mechanic and stoker was dragged out of bed. Many didn't even have time to dress. Half naked, they ran into the engine room and pushed the old Carpathia beyond anything she had ever done before. The captain ordered the heating shut off, so all steam could go to the engines. Passengers woke up freezing in their cabins with no idea why. A ship built to cruise at about 13 knots was now racing at nearly 17, weaving between icebergs in the dark. At first, the passengers were told nothing, to avoid panic. When they were finally informed that Titanic was sinking, many refused to believe it. "That's impossible," they said. "It's Titanic. Be honest. Is there a fire?" But even at full speed, Carpathia would be too late. Meanwhile, aboard the Titanic, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The deck was literally tilting beneath people's feet. The bow was sinking deeper and deeper. The list was growing. Crowds slowly gathered on the upper decks, but there was still little panic, mostly confusion. People were dressed in whatever they had grabbed, some wearing 3 coats at once, others in pajamas with boots. People carried absurd things. One survivor later recalled how he grabbed a heavy box containing securities worth $10,000, ran toward the lifeboats, suddenly came to his senses, turned around, and switched it for a tie pin and 4 oranges. First-class society tried to stay together, clustering in small groups. Almost everyone wore a life vest. There were more than enough vests on board, but many women initially refused to wear them because they were ugly. That strange mindset shows clearly in the loading of the first lifeboats. At the same time, scenes were unfolding that would later turn the Titanic into a legend of gentlemanly behavior. Multi-millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim helped load women and children into boats. Then he returned to his cabin, put on an immaculate evening suit, a top hat, gloves, and a boutonniere. When offered a life jacket, he replied, "Gentlemen, I am dressed as a gentleman, and I shall die as one." His friends from the card table looked around the deck, realized the odds were hopeless, returned to the smoking room, sat down to play, and kept playing until the tilt of the table made it impossible. Journalist William Stead sat quietly with a book, a man who had written about maritime safety now dying in the exact scenario he once described. Thomas Andrews was last seen standing by the fireplace, staring at a painting, clearly making no attempt to run. John Jacob Astor, Martin Rothschild, and many others placed their wives, daughters, and maids into boats and remained behind. Isidor Straus, founder of Macy's, and his wife Ida refused to separate at all. Ida declared that if they had lived together, they would die together. They were last seen standing on deck, holding each other. He was 67. She was 63. Third-class passengers behaved no worse, and often more bravely, especially considering how often they were forgotten in the chaos. This was not a deliberate policy of locking the poor below. It was organizational collapse. The ship was enormous. Somewhere, a gate was forgotten. Somewhere, it was opened but no one explained where to go. Somewhere, women were escorted in groups. Elsewhere, not even that happened. Toward the stern, people began climbing upward using ropes thrown over the side. In the end, it was confusion, not design. And tellingly, most surviving passengers from third class did not voice angry accusations afterward. It was accepted almost instinctively. A more expensive ticket increased your chance of survival. This was a world where class hierarchy was not questioned. It was accepted, by the rich and the poor alike, as simply how life worked. The Titanic kept sinking bow first. At 1:45 a.m., the Carpathia received the last, more or less clear message. "Hurry, old man. The engine room is flooded up to the boilers." After that, the signal weakened. The telegraph began producing meaningless noise, and 15 minutes later, water started entering the radio room. Captain Smith walked the ship, thanked the crew for their service, released them from duty, and said something close to, "Every man for himself now." Around 2 in the morning, the second-to-last lifeboat was lowered, already packed with people. A conflict flared around it, but 2 warning shots into the air from one officer were enough to end it. At 2:05 a.m., the last full-size lifeboat was launched. It had space for 47 people, while roughly 1,000 were still on board. About 20 women and children were allowed in. As the boat was being lowered, 2 men jumped down onto it from the deck, barely avoiding broken legs. Another man was pulled out of the water. The orchestra kept playing until the very end, until the musicians were literally swept off the deck. 2 collapsible boats remained. They were stored on the roof of the officers' quarters in such an awkward position that at first no one could free them. Then they couldn't unfold them. Then they couldn't drag them to the side. In the end, it no longer mattered. The water came to them. A massive wave rolled over the deck and washed people into the sea. One collapsible boat filled with water, the other was flipped upside down. From that moment on, survival depended on being young, strong, and sober, or outrageously lucky. One of those who had both was 17-year-old John Borland Thayer II, the son of the railroad tycoon we began this story with. He jumped into the water and swam toward the overturned boat. Senior baker Charles Jogan reached it as well. Jogan was especially lucky. Right after the collision, he had begun warming up with brandy, and by 2 a.m. was so drunk that the freezing water shocked him into alertness rather than killing him. Gradually, dozens of people gathered around the overturned boat. At first, they lay across the hull. Then they were forced to stand to make room for others. At some point, the second officer swam over and took command. At his orders, everyone leaned in unison, first one way, then the other, to keep the boat from capsizing. Those who tried to climb on when there was no room were pushed away. Cruel as it sounds, otherwise everyone would have drowned. According to survivors, many of the voices responding from the water weren't angry, but almost blessing-like. "All right, lads, hold on, God keep you." And then the person faded into the dark. Some later claimed they recognized Captain Smith's voice among the swimmers, a man who could have used his authority, but did not. At 2:15 a.m., the propellers rose into the air as the stern lifted high out of the water. At 2:17, the lights went out. At 2:18, the Titanic broke in two, and both halves sank. Those left in the water screamed. Most died within 10 to 15 minutes from hypothermia. The water temperature was near freezing. The screams were clearly heard from the boats, but none of the boats returned. People feared that desperate swimmers would capsize them. The few men and many women in the boats rowed as best they could, mostly in circles, simply to keep from freezing. Most oars were in the hands of women. The tillers were handled by sailors assigned during launch. Once the ship vanished, the sense of unity vanished with it. Each boat became its own small world. In one, women argued with men over smoking. The men didn't care. In another, two women fought. One lady went mad and repeatedly wound an alarm clock she had somehow brought with her. In another, kindness ruled. A sailor gave a woman his warm socks, saying, "Don't worry, ma'am, they're clean. I put them on this morning." Out of the darkness, someone muttered, "Damn it, it feels like a picnic." And it almost did, a horrifying parody of one. No wind, smooth water, boats drifting gently with women inside them. At 4 in the morning, dawn broke. Survivors would later say it was breathtaking, pink and beautiful. In that light, they could see the sea littered with ice, and on the horizon, finally, the Carpathia. It took time to collect all the lifeboats. Waves had risen, women struggled to row. When Lady Rothschild's Pomeranian was lifted aboard, one sailor tried to refuse. It seemed obscene that 1,500 had died, and a dog survived. She replied that if the dog stayed, she would stay too. The crew gave in. The dog climbed aboard, shaking violently, very much like the people who were pulled up next. Bruce Ismay was lucky. He had made it onto the second-to-last lifeboat. He claimed there had been no rowers, and he jumped in to help. Many survivors simply called him a coward. On the Carpathia, he asked for a cabin far from everyone, spent days in silence, and barely ate. Baker Jockin, who had spent an hour and a half in freezing water, felt, unbelievably, almost fine. The Carpathia set course for New York. There, lists of survivors were already being posted, and relatives, the Rothschilds, the Astors, and thousands of others, besieged the offices of White Star Line, where some people even managed to make fortunes on the company's fluctuating stock in just a single day. The Carpathia rescued 712 people. More than 1,500 died. The numbers were merciless. In first class, 62% survived. Out of 144 women, 140 lived. Of 6 children, 5 survived. In second class, 41% survived. Of 93 women, 80 lived, and not a single child died. In third class, only about a quarter survived. Out of roughly 900 passengers, most simply never made it up to the deck. Out of about 900 crew members, the majority died. Officers, sailors, firemen, and musicians. The disaster changed maritime safety forever. Public investigations were held in both Britain and the United States. From them came rules that now seem obvious. There must be enough lifeboat seats for everyone aboard. Continuous radio watch became mandatory. Ice tracking systems were introduced. International coordination was established. And after Titanic, no serious company ever again advertised its ships as unsinkable. The Titanic sank in 1912. The Carpathia died in 1918 off the coast of Ireland, not to ice, but to a German torpedo. Titanic's sister ships, Britannic and Olympic, were no longer carrying millionaires by then. They carried ammunition and wounded soldiers. Britannic hit a mine in the Mediterranean and sank. Olympic once rammed and sank a submarine, but that would not save her from her own fate. During the Great Depression, she was retired and cut apart for scrap. The Golden Age ended forever. No more children working in shipyards. No more captains blindly trusting technology. No more unshakable faith that progress will solve everything. But with it vanished the world of breathtaking liners built like works of art, and a world of billionaires who, when it came to it, were willing to die as gentlemen without losing face. The wreck of the Titanic still lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, nearly 2.5 miles deep. Raising it whole is impossible. The hull has sunk deep into the seabed and is too badly damaged. But expeditions have recovered thousands of artifacts: porcelain, jewelry, clothing, interior details, wine bottles, more than 1,800 objects in total. In 2012, Australian businessman Clive Palmer announced plans to build an exact replica, Titanic II, with the same luxury but modern safety systems. And in Belfast, on the site of Harland and Wolff, where the original ship was built, the world's largest Titanic museum now stands. In 1997, James Cameron released his famous film, which for many years was the highest-grossing movie in history. Not long ago, one famous prop was auctioned: the wooden door on which the heroine survived. It sold for $719,000. Cameron himself has dived to the wreck 33 times and said he saw everything there, except human remains. There is a theory that below 2 miles down, the chemistry of the ocean dissolves the human body completely over time, even bones. This, then, is the story of the Titanic. Not just a ship, but an era that believed it had conquered the ocean, and in the end, went down with it. Thank you for listening and for caring about history. I'll see you in the next story.